There is no way. It shows, for one, the government can't sell it.
Today, Labor leaders now want to divorce the Greens, or so they claim. Our Navy gives boat people a lift from Indonesia, but why? The G20 summit, a strange way to market Brisbane. And Ita Buttrose is sick of government attacks on the media.
Tell them to get out of our turf.
I'm Andrew Bolt, and this is the Bolt Report. It was the wedding of the year. Julia Gillard married Labor to the Greens 2 years ago in a deal to make her Prime Minister. In exchange, Gillard gave the Greens their carbon tax, breaking this now infamous promise.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
Now, too late. Many Labor figures say Labor got far too close to the Greens and needs a divorce.
The Greens political party are not our friends, they are not our allies, they are our political rivals.
The Greens have been aggressive towards us, and for too long we have been appeasing...
Quite a long time ago in my Whitlam Institute speech, so I'd refer you to that.
Now, that Whitlam speech was actually more than a year ago now and was a little more than a clumsy sledge.
And the Greens will never embrace Labor's delight at sharing the values of everyday Australians. Those Australians who day after day do the right thing, leading purposeful and dignified lives, driven by love of family and of country.
And what has Labor actually now done to disown the Greens? Has it axed their carbon tax? Scrapped their regular meetings with the Prime Minister? No, Labor's New South Wales conference this weekend agreed only to put the Greens perhaps a little lower on some how-to-vote cards. Well, whoopee-doo. And even then, some on the left, like former Defence Minister Senator John Faulkner, weren't that happy at being told by rising Labor stars like young union boss Paul Howes to fight the Greens a bit harder.
I've even, Paul, fought more Greens and Liberals and Nationals than you've done media interviews. Why don't you just put a sock in it for once?
Labor's going about this completely the wrong way. Yes, many Labor people are genuinely angry the Greens get the credit for Labor policies, while Labor gets the blame. They hate Greens posing as Labor's soul, as former Greens leader Bob Brown did again this week.
Dastyari's position, Paul House's position, is a gift to Tony Abbott. How hurting is that for Labor voters? Their only option is to come across to the Greens.
But reality check. Labor isn't in strife because it's losing votes to the Greens, but because it's losing votes to the Liberals. It's gone too far left. Labor can't now attack the Greens as mad and bad, but still stay married to them. It wants to prove it really has divorced the Greens? Then, Miss Gillard, tear down this deal. More on Labor and the Greens later, but first, the people smugglers have a new tactic. At least 3 boats in the past couple of weeks have sent fake distress calls from Indonesian waters. In fact, as close as 80 kilometres from the Indonesian coast. Yet somehow it's the Australian Navy that's picked them up each time and given them a lift all the way to Christmas Island. Joining me is Scott Morrison, the opposition's immigration spokesman. Scott, in a year, say the polls, you'll be the immigration minister. Will you then tell our Navy to return boat people to Indonesia if they are picked up just off the Indonesian coast?
Our policy is to turn boats back where it's safe to do so, Andrew. We have been so clear about that that I don't think anyone could doubt our commitment to that policy. We understand it well. And the suggestion that those in the Navy can't undertake this task, I think, is an insult to the Navy. We know that in the Gulf they've boarded 1,000 vessels or so in extremely hostile situations. So the suggestion that they somehow can't undertake this task with their professionalism, over 14,000 serving personnel personnel in the Navy a budget of $4.4 billion and better equipped vessels. The Armidale-class vessels are even better equipped to undertake these interceptions and boarding arrangements than what we did last time we effected this policy. So we are committed to that policy.
Quite specific, though. In the circumstances that we're seeing where our Navy picks up boat people at sea, issuing a fake distress call, does the naval ship go to Christmas Island or does it go to Indonesia to drop them off?
Well, I think the law of the sea and the Solace Convention is very clear about this, and that is in the Indonesian search and rescue zone, the legal obligation in terms of where the port you go to is in Indonesia. And a search and rescue operation, I think the legal situation is even clearer. And one of the things I've found very distressing, particularly over the recent weeks and that last tragedy, is why the government didn't immediately seek to have high-level bilateral discussions about getting greater clarity about where people would go after they've been picked up. Because you're right. I mean, Julia Gillard has turned the Royal Australian Navy into a water taxi service. I noticed today she's announcing turning Garden Island into a park or something of that nature. Well, that is another issue, but she's already turned the Navy into a water taxi.
But would you then say to the Navy, first option, if you pick them up 80 kilometres, 100 kilometres off the Indonesian coast, in Indonesian waters, back to Indonesia they go?
Well, that is the search and rescue provisions under the law, Andrew. So, of course, that would be the direction we'd take.
So Indonesia sees an Australian warship turning up to Iraq or wherever. What do they say?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily be a warship that might have to affect that transfer, but the law of the sea and the Solace Convention and the search and rescue protocols are very clear. And they were made very clear after the Tampa incident when back in 2004 the provisions were changed and the guidelines were changed so that the master of a vessel who picks up people in distress has the ability to go to the place that is most practicable and closest to be able to get those people to safety. So we're not dealing there with the other arrangements around turning boats back, which operate under other provisions, where in that situation we're talking about the safety of life at sea, and the obligations, I think, on everyone there are very, very clear.
I've been really surprised by Julia Gillard's hostility suddenly to the idea of turning back the boats. I want you to have a look at this. This is Julia Gillard in 2002. She seemed to be all for it then. Have a look.
We think that it is important that we do everything we can to disrupt people smuggling, and we think turning boats around that are seaworthy, that can make the return journey and are in international waters fits in with that.
What's changed her mind, do you think?
Well, good question. You can ask the same thing of Kevin Rudd, who said the same thing before the 2007 election and abolished that policy and every other policy we had to have strong borders after that election, and that's the reason we're in the mess now. I mean, the Labor Party's hypocrisy, and particularly Julia Gillard's and Kevin Rudd's on this issue, is breathtaking. I mean, they have talked about supporting every policy under the sun, but won't implement the policies that actually worked, and that's what they continue to refuse to do so, even to this day. Our policies can be restored under current law. She can't blame the Parliament, she can't blame Tony Abbott, she can't blame anyone else other than herself for the mess that she has put this country in on our borders. OK,
in the last minute or two we got left, Labor's in a fight with the Greens. Have the Liberals also been spooked by the Green movement? I mean, you're promising to spend $10 billion on global warming programs that won't actually do a thing to cut the world's temperature. Are you just as much to blame?
No, of course not. I mean, what the Prime Minister has to do today is she has to front up to the Labor conference in New South Wales and come clean on where she thinks her relationship is with the Greens. I mean, she was the one in the wedding pictures with Bob Brown. We've heard from every other faceless person in the Labor Party about this arrangement except the Prime Minister herself. She needs to say whether she thinks that the tail that has wagged this dog of a government for the last few years is going to continue to wag this dog of a government. And if she doesn't believe that should be the case, she should tear up the alliance, and if she doesn't, this is all just another phony war from another phony Prime Minister with the Greens.
And just quickly, you don't think it's a mistake for the Liberals to have $10 billion on useless global warming programs?
Well, no, our programs are designed to produce better soils. They're designed to produce a better environment. I mean, regardless of what one's position might be on climate change, they're good policies.
$10 billion.
These are good policies, and they're good for our environment. But they're not driven by some religious zealotry like we've seen on the Labor side of politics, and particularly driven by the Greens driving the Labor Party into the world's biggest carbon tax, a tax of deceit based on a lie.
Well, Scott Morrison, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks very much, Andrew.
Coming up, state Labor leaders tell Julia Gillard to stay home. So how's she supposed to lead Labor's campaign next year? Unemployment this week went up again to 5.2%. The government played it cool.
There is softness in the Australian labour market, but Australia is hanging in there.
Any number of the representatives who are in European economies, they would literally do anything to have the same economic story and statistics as Australia.
But Don Argus says our leaders are too complacent. Argus is one of our most respected business leaders, a former BHP Billiton chairman and National Australia Bank boss. He this week warned government spending was too high and workplace laws too rigid. The carbon tax would hurt, and just a small fall in the record prices we get for our resources could destroy the budget. Joining me is former Workplace Relations Minister Peter Reith and former Labor advisor Greg Turnbull. Greg, it's not often that a senior businessman sort of criticises government policies. They get whacked back. What's going on, do you think?
Well, I think, look, I don't think it's not unique, but it's certainly not something that you see all the time at that level. But I think that the criticism, you've got to pick it apart a little bit. The fact of the matter is, as the Prime Minister said in that grab just there, that people in Europe and other parts of the world would lay awake at night dreaming of having our problems in terms of economic management. And as for industrial relations, there is a review of the Fair Work Act underway at the moment. Let's see what that brings forward.
It sounds to me a bit complacent, though, doesn't it, Peter, to be saying, oh, well, it's worse somewhere else. The problem is, are we doing enough here?
Well, it's as obvious as it can be. I mean, the fact is that we've had a good run, you know, in the last 10 or 15 years with the mining boom. But when you look at the prospects on just the prices of our exports, and on top of that, look at the essential elements of a successful economy, there are very significant worries about where Australia's going. And, you know, Jack Nasser, Don Argus, I mean, even in industrial relations, only a few days ago, we had both Simon Crean and Martin Ferguson worried about the impact of trade union activities in the resources sector, pushing up the fact that, you know, our cost of doing business in Australia in the resource sector is higher than virtually anywhere. So, I mean, whatever Julia Gillard tells you, you know, people aren't clapping overseas about how great Australia's doing on its costings, you know, because that in the end, that means less business for us in the future, and the fact of the matter is any mining boom comes to an end. So, well, you know, this is the big worry. This is correct,
Peter, because just only a couple of days later, China announced that it had posted the 6th month quarter straight of lower growth, and there's also lower export from China. That's got to impact on our resources. Problem is, those resource prices can't keep staying high enough to keep the economy, our economy, solvent.
Well, I think that's right, and that's got to be a concern and a matter of long-term management for whoever's running the Australian economy. But I note that
But where's the sense of urgency from Labor, Greg?
Well, the Treasurer happened to be in China when those figures came out, and he pointed out, as I read in the paper yesterday, that yes, the Chinese growth rate's down from 9.5 to 7.5%.
Yes.
So and I gather it as a result of a government direction. So let's not say the sky's falling because a growth rate goes to 7.5%.
No, it's not, but it's much lower, and the thing is, it's going to take off the upward pressure on resources prices, and we're spending like drunken sailors based on the assumption they're going to keep being that high. But the point is now, you've got Don Argus, you've got Jack Nasser, you've got Gary Banks from the Productivity Commission, etc., etc. Is Labor losing touch with the business community?
Well, I think it's something that they have to work on because it's very important to keep a dialogue with the business community. But, I mean, you've also got to read between the lines a little bit. Of course, people in the business community say they want more flexibility in the workplace. workplace. But as Labor often points out, to some people flexibility means a reduction in the terms and conditions of employment, and Labor will fight that. That's
but what I'm
Labor's
saying
about.
is it used to be, for the first couple of years, Peter, that the business leaders really said very little. In fact, a lot were lining up to support the carbon tax. Now the traffic's all the other way.
Well, look, the fact of the matter is that they might be polite from time to time.
Or scared.
Yeah, or scared. But the truth is that people like Tony Shepherd, they are speaking out in a way they've not done for probably a decade. And that's not based on some, you know, sort of ideological thing. I mean, they can see, well, there's nothing wrong with self-interest. They're trying to run their businesses successfully and trying to give, you know, keep people in employment. And, you know, you only have to look at what the Productivity Commission said on the retail sector. I mean, there are swagger problems in that, just on the workplace relations area, something that could be done, but of course can't be done because, as Gary Banks said, well, you know, you start talking to the trade union movement and they're all back in the days of the satanic mills. I mean, they are so far removed from the reality of trying to hang on to jobs in Australia. All they can see is pushing their own barrow and you know, and taking what they can off the low paid, which is what's happened with the HSU.
I think we're cruising for a bruising. But Julia Gillard is not just having trouble with the business constituency. I'm struck, Greg, by the fact that Labor's leaders in Western Australia and in Northern Territory this week said that they won't be asking Julia Gillard to come and campaign in their elections next month and next year. Victorian Labor doesn't want her to campaign in next Saturday's Melbourne by-election. And she made just one appearance in the Queensland election campaign. How can federal Labor campaign with a woman who no state leader seems to think is someone that they can trust to come and drag votes to them?
Well, I think possibly because, unlike so many commentators, the voters of Australia do make a distinction between state and federal politics. And I think that this sort of kabuki theatre that goes on about whether a Prime Minister is going to be invited into a state election or not is just that, a bit of theatre. The fact of the matter is...
Did Bob Hawke stay away from state elections?
Well, Bob was probably a special case, I think. He was, and still is.
No, but the point is, popular federal Labor leaders are always involved. Bob Hawke was a vote magnet. Julia Gillard is being told to stay away.
Well, yeah, and of course, if she went into those elections, she'll be blamed for the result. Now that she's not been invited into those elections, she'll still be blamed for the result. So, you know, it's a bit of a no-win for her.
Yeah, well, she deserves to be blamed for the result. I mean, look at unemployment this week's up again. OK, not a huge jump, and we'd had a big...
I'm glad you said that before I did.
Well, I mean, no, you've got to be fair about it. Yeah. But, I mean, even Labor's own budget says unemployment's on the rise. And, you know, if you take the scenario that Andrew talks about, falling resource prices, you know, a few other things thrown into the carbon tax, I mean, the fact is it could be a lot worse than what Labor's saying. These are big worries for people.
Greg, this is the thing. Julia Gillard is already being blamed. I thought it was really instructive that Victorian Labor has leaked against her, saying voters in the state seat of Melbourne, which is going to a by-election on Saturday, naming her government 3 times more often than the Baillieu government in explaining why they're not going to be voting Labor in a state election. That is a terrible sign.
Well, it is very disturbing for the Labor supporters, I agree, and I think that by-election will be almost certainly bad for Labor, and it will be sheeted home to federal Labor. The question is, for all of us observing, is whether that plays through into the leadership talk that's around.
I think that's very interesting. I think it will, actually, Peter. I really do. And another pressure on Julia Gillard comes from this tiff, this lovers' tiff between the Greens and Labor that we saw play out and come to finality at the State of New South Wales Labor Conference this weekend. What did you make of that? What is going on? Is it a genuine argument, or is it just a little bit of positioning, huff and puff, leading to nothing?
Look, these people could not organise a chook raffle, let's face it. I mean, there's no strategy, no sense of where Labor really wants to go. I mean, they had this young lady in The Australian yesterday talking about Labor values. The young lady in Australia was a national vice president of the Labor Party. Yeah. Are kids leading the Labor Party now? Well, I tell you what, they basically have no idea of what they're talking about. I mean, she said, oh, you know, Labor values in the seat of Melbourne, you know, putting money into the Children's Hospital and medical research. Well, quite frankly, on those two, you know, you could pick out, you know, the Murdoch family, Ron Walker, the Smorgans. There's a whole lot of Melbourne families who don't call themselves progressive, but they certainly get on looking after our community. And if that's what Labor thinks is what they stand for, well, quite frankly, they might as well join the Liberal Party.
No,
I mean, seriously, they have no idea of where they stand.
Well, I think, Greg, one of the problems is that with this antagonism towards the Greens, I think Labor's losing sight of the fact they're not losing votes to the Greens, they're losing votes to the Liberals.
Well, I think they won't be losing any votes to the Liberals in the Melbourne by-election because the Liberals aren't standing. No. But I think that, look, I think this flows from the asylum seeker debate, the emotional debate in Parliament that led to not very much, and where the Greens yet again show that they won't compromise on that issue. Yep. And I think that that really got up the nose, as it were, of a lot of Labor people, and that's being reflected in this. But at the end of the day, I think it falls probably into, you gave the option of categories, probably into the huff and puff category, because it's not going to change much. No, and I think it does need to. I think they really need to scrap the deal. Look, just finally, just to let Greg have a win here too, the LNP conference in Brisbane featured Clive Palmer, the mining billionaire, giving speeches, flirting again with running for politics, claiming he might even run a newspaper with Fairfax sacked journalists. Doesn't this guy make the LNP look arrogant, unprofessional, hillbilly? Why is he the face of the LNP?
Well, let's face it, he's entertaining, and the media is giving him a hell of a lot of a run. Whether they'll go on doing so, I mean, I would have thought, you know, they'll become the day will come when basically we've all had enough of Clive, no disrespect, Clive, but I think that really, if you go to Queensland, people are impressed with what Campbell Newman's doing. All this stuff with Clive, quite frankly, it's a bit of a side issue, and entertaining as it is. So, is it a big problem for them politically? No, but I do think
they should put him in a cupboard.
Well, it'd be a big cupboard, wouldn't it?
It would be a big cupboard, but and it should be soundproofed. Peter Reith, Greg Turnbull, thank you so much for joining me. And coming up, the Gillard government spends nearly $400 million to buy Brisbane some trouble. The Gillard government this week picked Brisbane to host the G20 meeting of world leaders in 2014. So, what will Brisbane get from an event likely to cost us around $400 million?
For the rest of their lives, it does mean that people like the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of India, the President of China will be able to say to people, I went to Brisbane.
How nice for them. But Queensland's Premier says this will attract tourists and business.
We see it as a great opportunity over the next couple of years and after the G20 to really market Brisbane and Queensland as the go-ahead sort of place that it is.
Really? Well, Melbourne hosted the G20 6 years ago. How many people watching the TV reports thought Melbourne looked a great place to visit? 2 years ago, Toronto hosted the G20. How many people watching TV thought, gee, I'd love to do more business in Toronto? About this many, I'd say. Treasurer Wayne Swan is calling in the broadcasting police to punish 2GB's Ray Hadley for calling him a liar and a buffhead. Ridiculous, but also sinister, part of the Gillard government's war on free speech. This buffhead campaign includes calling an inquiry the Greens wanted into the hate media and threatening journalists with a super cop that could jail them and will police even blogs. What is this, a police state now? Well, Ita Buttrose, who has edited newspapers, Clio, Women's Weekly, has had enough. Here she is at the National Press Club this week.
I do not believe in regulation of the media by government. Well, I don't hear the public complaining about the media. I do hear the politicians. We need to speak out more passionately about what we do and tell them to get out of our turf.
Spot on, Ita. Our Free Speech Award is on its way to you. And that's the show. Thanks for watching. Meet the Press is next with Paul Bongiorno and his guest Warren Truss. I'm Andrew Bolt. Goodbye.